So I was in my studio. I heard all these sort of like clatters going out. I went outside, and they're literally doing soil sampling from outside the building in the centre of Newcastle. And they're excavating using, now Robert probably knows this terminology, they actually draw it up within a sort of like a plastic tube. Soil samples from 35 to 40 meters deep below ground. So they're drawing up this loam clay with sandstone in it. And of course, they take one section, and I was just taking the stuff up to my studio. So talk about preservation. Upstairs now in my studio, I've got soil deposits from between 11 and 33,000 years ago. Actually, firing was one of those things that I did think about what I could actually work with that material. I was thinking about whether it would be a good print surface to roll off. So this idea about firing with different materials, I would like to see how I could manipulate them by perhaps firing. So seaweed, salt, we'll see where it goes. So this was literally a snatched conversation with the site supervisor, but was talking about sort of transition of materials across geographical site through climatic or environmental or whatever. And so this loam, this clay, as I understood it, but it was just like a snapshot of a conversation, but talking about actually glacial matter, bringing this clay that is now being sourced in Newcastle, actually something that's been brought there through glacial movement.
That's something I was thinking about a while ago as well, Kevin, was glacial drift, and the fact that what I'm kind of walking around on 10,000 years ago, it was kind of in Scandinavia, which accounts for kind of the soft boulder clay, the Holderness coast.
Yeah, no, I think that those concepts of change and just constant change on that issue of the Holderness coast. I mean, as we were coming back today, with my daughter in the car, you could see the line of the wolds, and that obviously used to be the coastline. So that whole arc of the wolds, and if you go to places like Surrey, you can climb up the cliff there, and you can find like a nice sandy beach halfway up the cliff that used to be the old beach deposit, and it's a really nice fine sand. You can make a nice sand castle out of it.
On the other end of things, at Withensea at the moment, there is saying it's a Victorian landfill. I don't think it's Victorian, but landfill from the early 20th century, I guess, which is it's sort of emerging in the strata, kind of poking its way out of the cliff and throwing like rubbish, bottles and all sorts of horrible things down onto the beach. And there's just very nice layer, this very nice deposit that's like this black tar with plastic falling out of it down onto the beach, and it stretches for quite a way actually. Yeah, really starkly highlights anthropogenic kind of impacts on, well, we're a marker in time, aren't we? It's one of those markers in time, I suppose.
I know markers in times change. I remember there was an article around excavating a rubbish tip in the States, and basically they were using Coca-Cola bottles as markers, because obviously the design and the type of glass and the thickness and the logos and all of the stuff that, there's specific years that certain bottles came into production or whatever. And then they can say, okay, that one's from 1950s, that's the 1940s, that's the 1928 model. And, little by little, we're able to reconstruct this history according to Coca-Cola, which was random by the side. But it was interesting what you were saying, Kevin, about the clay. Again, I'm very familiar with those long pilings and, those deposits pulled up. And, about 20 years ago, I used to work in Amsterdam with some colleagues, and the work there was around doing these deep cores in the Andes. But there they were going down sort of about 560 something meters, I forget, 568 meters or something like that, because essentially this lake had been sort of present, and as the Andes moved up, the lake stayed constantly a lake. So there was always a lake there. There was always sediment being deposited and clays at the bottom of the lake forming into this sedimentary column. So you could access that and have a continual record going back, since the Andean uplift, so 7 million years ago. And that was, I guess, cored in the 1980s, 84. And it's kept a lot of people employed ever since, just working their way through, going in, and as new methods come on board, Now it's all about isotopes and chemical signatures and very resolved analyses.
And breath as well. I think, and gases, for example, I guess in Antarctica, or samples from polar samples of, these things get trapped in ice, and you're definitely looking more at the slightest of sensory kind of ephemera that you wouldn't ever expect would be able to impart, such objective and clear information about things about how the environment looked thousands and thousands of years ago.
But it did make me also think about, we often think about borders being sort of horizontal, and actually putting up these piles, thinking about borders being sort of like vertical, which has sort of added a different sort of like idea for me conceptually about transition. We often think transit as in, I mean trans, across, that's the prefix, but actually we're thinking about vertical trans, as in the idea that someone sort of like travels, we can travel down or up vertically rather than just horizontally, and thinking about definitions. And then just maybe think a little bit also not only of just definitions, but also epochs. Jill sort of encouraged us to think a little bit across, not just from science to art, but also how it works back to science as well, about how science then conceptually can make us think about something visually in a different way. So the vertical rather than the horizontal when we think about a border. I thought that was, it's a little bit like these now lengths of soil in my studio. At the moment, sort of, I'm not sure where that goes next, but just that it gives you a purchase on thinking about something a little bit differently. And why I asked about the Michel Serres is a philosopher that I've suddenly become quite interested in because of his ideas about, obviously, science and art. He's one of those philosophers who really does think about translation as a passage, what he calls between domains, like between art and science. And one of the famous examples of him was thinking about Turner and the skies that he painted and those colors. And actually what he says is that Turner isn't only just painting industrial skies. So he's not just painting these sort of romantic chocolate boxed sort of like landscapes, but actually his work is being influenced by the skies that were being produced through the thermodynamics of the industrial revolution. But then Serres goes to the next step, is actually in the 1830s and 1840s while he's painting this, what is he's not just artistically responding to a phenomenon, but he's actually, through his art, contributing to the scientific about thermodynamics. So it works across his idea of passage. So yeah, so he also has terms like temps, T-E-M-P-S in French, which means time, but it also means climate. So how, a word or a phrase can unlock different ways of conceiving something. Or Derrida's term différence, which actually is poorly translated as difference in English, but actually it's a word that he made up, and it has this thing of like differ and defer.
Lots of visualizations of deep time sort of are outputted in the format of a cartography of time, which would be vertical, like the current epoch preceding. So you almost like work your way back from this proliferation of life that there is that we currently know and is familiar to us now, to a complete absence of anything, and mapping time. Often that does, especially within earth sciences, does take the form of, rather than a horizontal development, rather than something that is reliant on borders, it becomes like a vertical accumulation, like a trickle down kind of accumulation of a proliferation of different life forms and other things disappearing. And it's interesting to think about how we might perceive of like physical borders as looking like a landscape, as being like a horizon, something that cuts across a horizontal plane, but time as something that does this. It is really interesting to think about that, Kevin, and cartographies of time is something that I've been looking at for quite a while.
Yeah, it's just those additional dimensions, isn't it? And I often tell our students when we're taking these cores, literally we are traveling through time, and that coring device, your perspex tube that you're pushing down these sediments, that is your time machine. But the actual borders themselves are, again, really interesting. So, when we take these cores, we go away, do our analysis, and then we run it through a whole series of sort of sort of clustering programs to look at trends and changes, and we chop it up into identifiable zones, and then we transition from one particular characteristic to another characteristic. But often it's the transition which is the trickiest part of the whole process, because sometimes they're very gradual. You have a very sort of gradual shift in environment, or say human impact or whatever, that is causing that environment to change. But sometimes they can be incredibly abrupt. Literally you're going from one state to another state. There isn't that gradual transition that you would normally expect. And, I guess if you could view, that whole climate process as a bit of a sort of, a driver of transition. Clearly at the moment, we're going under a very abrupt change as a result of, global warming, and the rate of climate change at the moment is incredibly abrupt. So that almost is going to be one of our future very, very abrupt transition zones. If people come back in 500 years and analyze the air bubbles around at this time, they will see a very rapid change.
How does the interpretation of those transitional changes impact on your sort of I guess your action plans for what your projects then become? Like, what sort of impact do those abrupt changes have on the pace of your thinking and planning?
So a good example is, say, exploitation of elephants in East Africa. As soon as the Portuguese arrived into East Africa, they brought maize with them from the Latin Americas. That massive calorific injection into East Africa allowed caravan trades to function, and for people to carry ivory tusks in their thousands and thousands out of the continent. And then obviously that fed into the whole Victoriana and parlour games and pianos and billiards and Sheffield cutlery industry and all of those things. So that was a very rapid, abrupt change as a result of a new population arriving in a landscape. And that has completely transformed many of the ecosystems in East Africa. Because elephants, like, if you go to a nature reserve, wherever you are, you'll see Hebridean sheep or Highland cattle or Polish ponies, maintaining the sort of structure that they like. We were already chatting about borders, weren't we? If they're transition zones or whatever we like to call them, I guess they're always going to be, going from one state to another state, from one character to another character, or, one culture to another, or one crop type to another, or
You mentioned the word state there, Robert, like different states of matter, I suppose, states of being. But also there is, and something I've encountered in my work as well, is the incongruity between political borders or states in terms of the physical shape of the world. And maybe that's something that sort of impacts on some of the work you've done as well, Rob. I can imagine maybe that, we get to a state where, we're thinking about these conceptions of political borders as being hard, but actually geographically, they're very soft.
So socially as well, I mean, if you said, take again just examples, say Kenya and Tanzania to the south. I mean, it was obviously a border imposed in a room in Berlin back in the late 1800s, 1890 something. And there's a little interesting, obviously they're straight lines, and they reflect nothing apart from some random conversations that went on between colonial powers, cut cultures in half, family, kinship groups are just divided, but of course those borders aren't respected really. So people move freely across those borders, and cattle and things roam. Elephants obviously don't have passports and step to check in and move freely. And even, things like what was a straight line now has a kink in around Kilimanjaro. So Kilimanjaro I don't even know, it was given away as a Christmas present from Queen Victoria to Kaiser Wilhelm. So you have a straight line, a little kink around Kilimanjaro, and then another straight line, because it was used to be in Kenya and it was given to the Germans that at that time were looking after Tanzania in some way. So yeah, borders are generally, very artificial, particularly in terms of nation states, and particularly in the global south, where concepts of country, I guess, have been imposed, and imposed with very different value sets. And
I think that's really interesting, because we often think exactly sort of like on the map, a border is something fixed and stable. But what we're talking about philosophically is not producing something, but we're talking about this interaction or this exchange of ideas. But actually, that's a nice metaphor, that although it is drawn with a hard line across a map, actually interactively, in terms of populace, in terms of agriculture, in terms of many other sort of dynamics, they actually sort of are a nice metaphor for sort of like the philosophy of what we're talking about in terms of that flow of interaction between ideas, rather than deciding on something and settling on it, I suppose. I like that idea that it works both ways, actually. Literally what you just described there, that almost like philosophy or knowledge is in defiance of that imposition of a line, be it colonial, be it political.
yeah, and obviously, ideals are continually changing. Things like national parks, again, in East Africa, that used to be places for shooting and places of hunting. Of course, you can't turn up to a national park like the Serengeti now and say, "I'm here to shoot your rhinos," but obviously they did not that long ago. And as we've gone through the decades, they've transitioned from places of shooting stuff to places of preserving the keystone important animals, the rhinos, the elephants, the lions, the leopards. And now it's all around community conservation and community livelihoods and co-benefits, and people who live around those protected areas benefiting. But the boundaries have stayed the same, but rationales have completely changed, which causes obviously all sorts of problems in terms of, well, not so much problems, but challenges in terms of their contemporary management, and thinking who should benefit from them, why they should benefit.
But I think that's a great question then, Matt, because like I also think about those then interpreting voices in one way, how those voices of conceiving what's happening and articulating it sort of disrupt that fixed sense of border. Like it's almost like they sort of interfere with that, I suppose, in a colonial way, that idea of something, a right and wrong, a clear cut sort of like moral sense of what is right and wrong, political sense of division. But actually it's sort of like voices through their, I don't know, their livelihoods that actually disrupt that clarity.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I guess that cuts through to thinking about models of action, doesn't it? And value systems, like Rob said. I was reminded a little bit when we were talking before about visualizations and sort of visual modeling, like thinking about Mercator and thinking about the world map, for example, as an illustration with an agenda, an inadvertent agenda maybe that distorts has historically and continues in the public imagination to distort our understanding of how the world looks, but also the importance of nation states in comparison, from north of the equator to south of the equator. Africa, for example, seems minuscule in comparison to the objective correct size it would actually should appear, and if it weren't for that sort of possibly inadvertent distortion that managed to find its way into the textbooks of every student that's passed through a classroom in the past 200 years. There is an extent to which an individual voice, if it has enough political support and motivation behind it, could change something visually that had a long-lasting impact, and it illustrates that crossover between two different domains, between art and science, and how one can have a massive impact on the other in terms of the public imagination. And I don't know whether either of you have come across the writings of W.G. Sebald, but he wrote a lot about memory and conceptions of memory. And one of those, there were a couple of those that kind of steered my way through my research over the past couple of years, actually. And one of them was this idea that memory you could conceptualize or imagine as being beneath you, as if you're standing on the edge of a cliff and peering down on a precipice, and you have this frightening kind of vertiginous sense of like falling back into it, or falling into something that might have been traumatic. It's there at the base of everything. It's on the shore, and you're petering sort of on the cliff top, looking down at that, and there's this vertiginous sense of looking down again. And the other was something that he said about, he made an analogy between memory and borders and fault lines. He said that we're living on the borderline between the natural world from which we're being driven out and the other world that is generated by our brain cells. And where those lines rub up, those tectonic lines rub up against each other, pain occurs. And memory is one of those sorts of pain that is inescapable. So these kinds of things, like making that analogy between what we would term as being the natural world, natural as we know it is as much a label as post-natural. The conceptions of what is wild, or what is natural, and what is the default, the global default, and the world that generated by our brain cells, like whether that is government, whether that's politics, whether that's the state, nation state. The borderline is very is always in flux. But most of us live somewhere along that borderline, that mental borderline. And I think maybe when you get into working with communities who live on literal borderlines, or what we might recognize as being objective borderlines, which obviously they aren't as much, maybe that's where that painful memory kind of exists. I suppose where that might relate back to what you were saying, Robert, about describing the sort of scramble for East Africa, how that 150 years ago is, I imagine, still very much deeply entrenched in cultural memory in an active way, rather than, it's not just something that, well, that happened and that's the history. And obviously with British colonialism and the empire no longer exists, but does it really? I mean, it for a lot of people that is still a reality, isn't it?
Very much so, very much so. And on the more extreme case, I mean, we do a lot of work with colleagues in South Africa, and so we spent quite a bit of time in Southern Africa. And obviously apartheid officially finished with Botha, and so when was that? 20 years ago or something like that. That is still an incredibly divided country. There's still massive divides between haves and have-nots, and invariably they're racially divided, immensely. And so you can't just transition. You don't just go from a colonial to a post-colonial world overnight, and pack up your bags and everything's hunky-dory. Okay, we've got a new dawn. The act has changed, but obviously there's so much momentum in the system that those types of social changes will take generations to change.
There must be an extent to which that isn't a linear process either. I think something that I've encountered in academia a lot is, and the way we're kind of like our overarching public curriculum has kind of embedded this idea of linear progress since the Industrial Revolution. But I think art, any form of art, actually, art disrupts that because it's inherently almost a Mobius strip. Art doesn't work in the same way. It has to be cyclical and exists on feedback loops. And those feedback loops is very similar to what I think happens in the imagination and our understanding of what went before and how that informs the present. I don't know whether you agree with that, Kevin, whether that rings.
So what it made me think of is that in art history, at least, neuroscience is playing a more increasing role in the idea of, I suppose, until the last 10, 15 years, I suppose art history's been dominated by sort of structuralist thought or post-structuralism. And now phenomenology is sort of like a philosophy that has been taken up by many art historians in understanding works, not as in what does this work represent, but more what does it do? What does it make us feel? What the affectivity of it? And neuroscience is providing a lot of that information about how does the brain respond to an artwork, for example, a video or a live performance. When we're talking about movement, we're talking about heat, we're talking about elements that aren't easily conceptualized in representation, but how do they make us feel in that moment? And so when you were talking about natural world and then memory and brain cells, I went sort of then to brain cells, thinking about neuroscience and about that as we get more of a purchase on just how does the brain work and ideas of feeling emotion. I mean, how does that then help us interpret artworks? So that's sort of that thing about art and science working together in terms of working both ways, I think. And it reminded me a little bit of sort of like, now I know absolutely nothing of this, but quantum stuff. I mean, it really makes me think of sort of like the quantum physics rather than the hard, the sort of like, instead of the Newtonian idea of the world. It does make me think a lot more of sort of like the quantum element, about how one element can be in two places at the same time, about something a lot more, something that denies something fixed.
Very much into the idea of the belief that the brain is that we are all essentially time travelers. Time travel is this sort of obviously this conventional sci-fi kind of fantasy concept of what if we could travel through time. The fact is we already are time travelers, and the brain is the ultimate time traveler. The human brain's maybe the ultimate time traveler, although it's difficult to say that. The idea of what is it that I'm doing that informs the future, and to what extent could my practice be talking more about or speculating or thinking about how what I'm doing now might help a community, or might push something forward, or might change something, or be more socially engaged. And for the past few years, especially, my practice has been about this sort of speculative ancestral memory, and this idea of an excavation of my own past being defined by what's not there, which runs parallel to what seems to be the basis of the fossil record, which owes its existence to absence. And things have emerged in interrogating those spaces in between what I remember and what I don't about my childhood, the shape of the coast, the feeling of the marsh beneath my feet as a kid, or the pain of walking on chalk boulders to smash open a rock, and just every now and again find that there's something inside that's been long gone. Or thinking about Arthur C. Clarke's idea about, or what he said about being behind every man stands 30 ghosts. All of these things are very entrenched in trying to understand the past, and I'm trying to get my head around how I could reframe or start to reframe some of the discoveries I've made to affect change in the present. And I wonder, Kevin, another one of those key words we were thinking about was carbon, and maybe that's more broadly related to materials and what you're hoping to do with, or thinking about doing with materials, some of those experimental ideas you have. To what extent do you think those might affect a kind of a change or a change in the response of the viewer?
Yeah, great question. There's a couple of things that sort of like triggered my responses to, first of all, borders, then social role, and then I will then come to the carbon. So first of all, with border, I thought it was really interesting, Robert, you were talking about East Africa and that there are communities literally living on a sort of like a geologically defined edge geographically. And what it made me think of was a long time ago, I was interested in sort of like Indigenous Aboriginal art in Australia and about how they would explain the landscape through mythology, like riverbeds being formed by a giant snake, for example. And I just thought there's another border. I was just interested in the people in East Africa or the community or the tribe that you were dealing with, whether they're buttressed, not literally just physically against, I don't know, an escarpment or a ridge or some fissure in the landscape, but whether they're meeting, for the want of a better word, Western geographical explanation of the landscape with a mythical interpretation of that landscape that they have through their culture. Now, all cultures are different, but it just made me think about Indigenous Australian culture and about how they would maybe define or determine or explain the natural features in a landscape in a very different way from a scientific maybe one, which then came on to what you were saying, Matt, about your interaction with the landscape and about sort of like, yeah, digging holes, climbing trees, you know, that way that a child maybe interacts with the landscape, piles of stones, secret places, burrows, dens, you know, that sort of interaction with the landscape, which was really, really interesting about how even in the sort of like a West, if you actually go into it, you understand that actually people growing up in the West, children, define the landscape very differently with a very emotional response. You know, they invest their stories in that landscape about where something is what, who did what there, you know. And then the last thing about the social thing, about practice, I mean, I suppose what's important is that what I'm going to say is so you can understand and also you can criticize, you know, you can't sort of critique somebody if you don't know where they're coming from. So my politics is of the left, and I sort of like when I left home, in a social sense, I was involved in the squatting movement in London in the 80s. So it was a very non-materialistic and also sort of like a very inner politics of not really sort of ownership. And so I now live in a bungalow, a house, privately owned. So, forgive me. But my politics, I suppose, when you said social practice, it felt like 2010 was revisiting 1979. And I felt actually just by pursuing art practice was in itself a social, almost like an opposition with what happened in 2010 with austerity and those sort of like right-wing politics. To me, was such a throwback to the 80s. I mean, obviously it has manifested itself differently, but those sort of that emphasis and those priorities politically in society, it did feel like it was a social engagement, even just doing your own individual personal practice. It felt like it was some sort of social opposition for me. But then the carbon, well, maybe, yeah. So the carbon bit, I was just going to come on to that. I was just thinking that was sort of like, in some way, yeah. So material, I draw with charcoal. So as a material, it's really important. I think environmentally, it's interesting about that sort of ethical responsibility about using materials from the landscape, about when you take something out of it. When a company dredges the seabed, Kevin going to the coast and actually picking off, you know, a 3x3 bit of card, the Vaseline on the, it's next to nothing. But ethically, what, you know, that role and interaction with the environment is really important, I think. Even if you're not having the same sort of impact as maybe some on an industrial scale. And I think also with the carbon was quite interesting for me was like, actually, although we think about carbon, we associate it, at least at the moment, with climate change and with industrialization. But the making of charcoal is something pre-industrial. I mean, this is a process that has existed for thousands of years in terms of that as a material. So I think that's quite nice how that straddles, actually, it works both ways.
Those things are ever present. I mean, clearly story is very important in many communities in the same way as I certainly have benefited from stories as a as a person over my life, and stories are a really important way that we are able to tap into not so much myths, but also responses, how people have the experience that they have, and how they have lived their experiences, how they live their lives, how they learn from their ancestors, and that gets passed through storytelling. This idea of memory, I think, is really interesting. And the thing you were saying earlier on, Matt, about having 30 ghosts behind us or whatever, what we're trying to do increasingly in our work is to try and think about the future, to think about those future ghosts and what's coming down the line. Because we go back to this idea of travel and time travel. We can go back in time, but the challenge, I guess, is really how to make the best future or try to carve out the best pathways into the future. But to do that, we have to draw on our memories. We have to draw on our pasts. So one of the things I'm really, I guess, pleased about is about the work we're doing in terms of trying to determine futures. So we developed this tool about 5 or 6 years ago called Kesho, which is Swahili for tomorrow, or well, often you would say it informally, Kesho, later, or sort of see you later. Future has to be guided by memories of why the relationships with the environments are as they are. And of course, different people having very different histories and very different perspectives. You can see how history is getting carved out now in terms of whose voice is important and whose voice is determining what that future could be like. And just to sort of sow a seed around the carbon issue. So carbon for us is really interesting, talking about carbon and how carbon we think of in terms of carbon storage in forests and trying to mitigate climate change. But we also use carbon to understand time. So we use carbon dating, so the ideas of radiocarbon, or radioactive carbon, or a percentage of carbon being radioactive and then decaying through time. And we know the half-life, so we can work out how much radiocarbon is present in the sample. We can say, okay, that's 1,850 years old. So we can translate our sort of unknown depth and these transitions that we were talking about earlier on, and crossing boundaries into some sort of scale that we that we can appreciate. Rather than saying I'm now at 10.3 meters, but if you say I'm now at 1,853 years ago, it makes a difference.
I think as you say, like carbon dating reveals the passing of time. To go back to your kind of line of inquiry, Kevin, and something you said earlier, the pursuit of art is almost, I think it's almost an attempt in one way sometimes to resist that passing of time, or to insert, as we've already said actually, to insert a series of markers within it. Or the idea that maybe even we can intervene, or we can shape time outside of what would be the default, or what we would label as natural. And of course we can, because time at the end of the day is to all intents and purposes a construct of our own making. So the history of making is suffused with reflection, which I think is something that is a shared device of the arts and the sciences, but also subversion. So maybe art has this history of subversion, of using materials, text, whether it's visual, non-visual, in unexpected ways to sort of reveal something about our common perceptions of the value of a material, the value of charcoal, or the agenda behind the representation of a story or a place. So maybe the idea that it takes burning charcoal to be able to understand what happens when you burn charcoal. And the question today, I suppose, is about how complicit we are with every little minute kind of step we're taking forwards in walking backwards at the same time.
I think what you have just said prior to that about we learn about charcoal by actually making charcoal. I mean, that idea of investigating the material or the substance is an important element. And it did make me think, again, I don't know enough about him, but a little bit what you were talking about, material and mythology, Joseph Boy's work, and his fascination with materials and mythology came about when he was actually a pilot with the Luftwaffe and was shot down over the Soviet Union. But he was, and I think he was badly injured, but he was actually found by a group of indigenous peoples. I can't remember what their name was, and they didn't hand him over to the authorities, but they actually bound him up in felt, using different waxes, different materials to heal his body. And that was one of those sort of like seminal moments for him, that when he came out after the war, he then investigated materials, including felt and wax and other things that he encountered there to interpret his world. So I think, Matt, what you were talking about, the investigation into materials and the mythologies around that is something that is quite interesting. So, but I did talk about that border between England and Scotland, the forests that do cross those borders too. I mean, that is a location that I am interested in, and taking the wood from those locations to turn into charcoal. And then, yeah, and again, I think I said less interested in the actual mark making. I wasn't thinking aesthetically about the quality of the charcoal as such. That was then part of the process of making work with it, which was very freeing, really, because you're not then bound with some sort of like more traditional aesthetic conception about what's happening. And I just think then, Robert, coming back to your thing about carbon and then dating, I think it's interesting that, so if we go backwards and forwards, so it's that Aboriginal idea that there's often a critique of Indigenous Aboriginal culture in Australia, but they don't create any structures. There's no architecture as such. They don't build. And that's been seen as a lack in the West, but actually sort of like anthropologists have seen that actually they do have a capacity for architecture in the way that they mythologize the landscape. They do have a capacity for architecture in the way that they actually understand it without actually building. And I think a little bit, it's what's come out of our discussion is that sort of like that tandem thing about carbon can actually be a residue that helps us understand the nature of something and its age.
So when we're looking for samples to date, because obviously it's quite an expensive process to go and send off a sample and work out how much sort of radioactive carbon is left in a sample. So often we would actually date pieces of charcoal. Yes, exactly. So I thought that might be interesting. So obviously fires in the landscape, you get tiny little bits of charcoal will come up. You know, when you have a bonfire outside, you can see little particles going up. That's all charcoal, which eventually will settle out in a lake or in the sedimentary sequence somewhere. Often we can identify and we pick little fragments of charcoal out and we'll send those off for dating. But we have to be very careful not to select a piece of charcoal which is from a chunk of wood, because obviously that charcoal could have come from a tree which has been grown in that landscape for, say, 500 years. So that piece of charcoal, because it's come from a trunk, as it were, a large, potentially old piece of wood, that would give us a wrong date. Or it'd give us, it'd give us the right date, but the right date would be wrong for our use. But also it comes back to this idea of increments, doesn't it, and boundaries, because obviously, obviously, as we all know, we've all counted tree rings, and obviously as your trees grow, you have your sort of, your boundaries each year between your sort of spring growth and your sort of winter cessation, and obviously that will come out in terms of your charcoal. And you have a very different appreciation of how you view charcoal. We view it as one as a medium for dating, and two particularly as a proxy for fires. And fires in the landscape, and as a result of obviously often human agency, but not always. Sometimes we have obviously natural fires caused by lightning strikes, and they are quite common. And I was mentioning earlier on about introduction of maize and things like that. Of course, when those things come into the landscape, when caravans start to come in, when ivory exploitation happens, your fire peaks go off the record. The nature of the interaction has changed. You've gone into a new state.
I suppose farming practices are central to kind of understanding that our species has shaped the world towards what we know of it now, and our knowledge of carbon, or our use of carbon dating in the present, something that's interested me a bit. And I think it goes back to this idea of the natural world as being a human construct, which again, if we're thinking about the framework of earth sciences, it's always underpinned, I think, by the fact that these fields are constructs as much as time. I think it wraps around itself quite nicely there. Like, the sciences are actively involved in pushing our understanding into the future to enact positive change. I think that's something that art does as well, but in very different ways. I think
it's really there to I guess show new ideas, new concepts, maybe let people think differently.
We talked about this right at the beginning, about this idea that it's not necessarily to produce something, but it's just exploring that interaction and exchange between ideas. And I think that has great value. There's no material element to them at all. But I do feel there's that sense of, like, it is a weakness, this idea that we have to produce. And I do feel that. And I do feel there are times when you can spend time either on your own or with others. And I mean, as an example here, the last 2 hours, and we can sort of like shoot the breeze and we can discuss things, and it's valuable. And I think I've come back to my practice very much with the idea of the moment, and it's ongoing. I don't have an agenda other than I am politically conscious that it is an agenda to produce work in this environment and know that it has no monetary value or financial value. I suppose I'm producing stuff and think about things in the moment, and I don't really conceive about its communicative or knock-on effects about what it might lead myself or others to do, having seen or witnessed it.
I suppose one of my closing thoughts might be that this conversation overall maybe has highlighted that a linear conception of progress across arts and sciences is maybe a very thin and fragile line, that in reality, in terms of how we make things, in terms of how we think about making things, speaking to each other, communicating ideas, that's not a practical way in which to work, and it doesn't necessarily reflect always the reality of how change happens, because it's always got to be informed by that which has gone before us, the idea of a narrative that underpins our lives. Again, that linear idea of the beginning, the middle, and the end. I think often it's the narratives that don't follow that conventional structure. It's when those things are broken that interesting things happen.